Welcome to Section 420, Talkin Yankees. Well, if you like funky baseball uniforms, then you're going to love our next guest. His name is Spencer Hodes. He runs a Twitter page called Vintage Jersey and Hats, which has nearly 30,000 followers and focuses on the funky baseball uniforms of the 1970s and early 80s. He's going to join us now and tell us some of the interesting stories behind some of these funky, colorful uniforms. Hey, Spencer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, people can follow you on Twitter. Again, you run the Vintage Jersey and Hats site, which people can follow at Polyester Unis, as well as to supplement that, you have your website, polyesterunis.com. So give us the backstory. Now, your Twitter page is pretty popular. You've almost got 30,000 followers. Why did you start it? When did you start it? And how did we able to, grow this audience?
Yeah. Why did I start it? I've always been interested in vintage jerseys and hats. I'm a little bit of a collector, so I have a lot of hats, I have a lot of jerseys, but I'm also interested in just general, aesthetics from especially baseball. The way it sort of got started back a few years ago, I was running a little league when my kids were younger. And as the president of the Little League, that's really a full-time job. So I was spending, I was doing my regular job and I was spending, I don't know, at least 30, 40 hours a week working on that. And, designed a lot of baseball hats, baseball jerseys, stuff like that while I was running that league. And about 2 years ago, right at the end of 2019, I retired from that job. It was time for somebody else to move in and I had a bunch of time on my hands. So I took this old Twitter account I had sitting around with, 30 followers or whatever it was. And I changed the name to Vintage Jerseys and Hats and just started posting stuff. When I first started, it was more than one sport. I would just post whatever I was thinking about at the time, but it became pretty clear pretty quick that, baseball's my thing. And I've always been into the 70s and 80s because that's when I grew up and sort of took off from there. Once the pandemic happened and there wasn't a lot of baseball, people got a little nostalgic for the 70s and 80s the way I was. And people just started following it. And here we are.
So in terms of the website and the Twitter page, that's all you run it all yourself?
Yep. I the website was just probably about 8 months into the Twitter page. It was clear that a lot of people were starting to follow, and I was getting a few interview requests and whatnot. And I figured, hey, let's make a website. People can go look at the stuff that I've done on Twitter. Twitter's a good one-off. Hey, here's a picture and here's a quick note about it. The website allows you to look at a whole bunch of that stuff at once. So,
gotcha. And just besides maybe growing up that era, what do you think in particular that people just have that fondness for that 70s, 80s period, kind of before before some of the big strikes and before the big money and all that stuff? Like, why do you think people just have a sort of fascination just for that period?
Well, I think it was a colorful time. Obviously, Yankees notwithstanding, it was a colorful time. The uniforms were getting more colorful. You had the powder blue coming in. Teams were trying out new things instead of just the white and gray. There were more different kinds of pinstripes. Obviously, the Yankees started that, but all of a sudden you've got the Cubs coming out with powder blue and white pinstripes, and you got teams coming out with red pinstripes, and even on top of that, again, I love the uniforms, but it's really the general aesthetic. You had a lot of different kinds of facial hair, all kinds of great. I just did a countdown on the 20 best mustaches of the 1970s. It was an interesting time. There was a lot more personality involved, but they did it within a uniform setting. These days, I like what they do these days with the different kinds of socks and stuff like that. But back then, everybody wore the same stirrups. Each team had their own. Everything from the top down was the same, but it was interesting. And to me, that once they got into the late 80s, into the 90s, and everything became darker, all the blues became navy, all the greens became forest green, everything started going black. It's not as interesting. So the aesthetics are not as interesting. It's not as colorful.
Yeah, I actually I was going to bring up the same thing about the facial hair when I was just kind of going through your website and look at the different, years of the 70s. I think you can look at someone, you just know that was the 70s versus you look at a player today, you can see a picture. Was that 2009 or 2019? I don't know. It kind of looks the same, but when you see a player from the 70s, you definitely know that was that decade without a
Yeah.
doubt.
Oh, absolutely. And even, you want to go a step further. Yeah, there's some great photography out there, but not everybody's a photographer in the 1970s. These days, everybody's a photographer and everybody can get a great shot and filter and all that stuff. Back then, it was an art form, and a lot of the stuff you find, it's got kind of that fuzzy feeling to it that makes you think about your childhood. And hey, 40, 50 years ago, everything's not as high def, I guess. It makes it more interesting, I think.
And just mentioned back, childhood, and just like looking back, I think also this is the difference with the money that the players make now versus back then. Just, I think back then, obviously they lived, they had a good life, but like some of the contracts you see right now, just astronomical. Looking at like Matt Scherzer getting over 100 million just for 3 years. It's just like, it's hard to connect with someone. Whereas a couple of decades ago, you could connect with one of those players because they have money in the pocket, but they're not uber rich. You still have a connection, like they're human just like you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, a lot of those guys, some of those guys were teachers during the off season. Some of those guys were going to medical school and became doctors. You don't see a lot of guys now retiring and then becoming doctors. It's it's a different world, but I'm not gonna get on somebody for making money.
For you personally, Matt, you started a collection a number of years ago, some vintage hats and jersey. What are maybe some of your favorite pieces you have?
Oh yeah. I've got again, I'd say I haven't counted in a while, but I think I have somewhere in the vicinity of 1,600 hats, probably 300 jerseys. So there's a lot in there. I kind of go back and forth. I don't wear the same thing over and over again, but I don't always a lot of people are like, hey, I got to have shoes that match my hat and I got to have this. I'll do that. But you know what? I'm a dad. People don't care if I have an exact match and whatnot, but I've got I think if I had to get down to it, my favorite hat that I own is probably one that I bought from a company called Hat Club a few years ago. In fact, the hat that I'm wearing right now is a Hat Club hat, but it's a Montreal Expos pinwheel hat. But instead of white on the front, it's powder blue. So it's basically like the road jersey with a home hat. That's a great hat. I think I've owned it for 3 or 4 years. It's a fairly new one, but it's a great hat. I love that hat. As far as jerseys go, I have several Tequila Sunrise jerseys. The Astros of the 70s and 80s. The pullover jersey with the stripes there. You can kind of see my logo has a little bit of Tequila Sunrise to it where it's different colors. The Astros of the 70s and 80s, always great. And the other thing that I really liked is the Pirates of the late 70s with what I call the triple pinstripes. So it's the white jersey with the yellow and black pins. It's like a yellow pinstripe with black on the outside. I have a Dave Parker, one of those. I love that jersey. Great jersey.
And now if people check out the website, polyesterunis.com, you posted a lot of these pics with some of them for sale. If you're not looking to get rid of them, but if someone twists your arm at a good offer, you are willing to part with them?
Yeah, I mean, the way I just set that up, the original idea when I set up the website was I was going to try and get my whole collection on there. That became difficult. Maybe eventually when I retire, I'll get that on there. I think I got several hundred hats and a few dozen jerseys on there, but when I started getting into that and I started realizing between hats and jerseys and jackets and bats and shirts that there's several thousand items and just didn't have time for it. But when I set that up, sort of the searchable database, the best way to do a searchable database on the website was to do like a store. MLB first released the Cooperstown collection in the 90s. New Era and American Needle were making hats. And at some point, this is right about when eBay started, right? I started getting together with American Needle and buying a bunch, not a ton, but a bunch of their overstock of the American Needle Cooperstown hats. So you'll notice if you go on the website, I have a few different, I still have some left, that I've had for 20 something years. So now they're vintage throwbacks, right? So at that point they're vintage. But I have a bunch of hats from American Needle that I just bought in boxes, whatever they had left over. A lot of Angel stuff. I have a few Yankees things, some Tigers, things like that, where it's like 1906 throwback hats. And so for those, the prices are more in the $40 to $50 range, just because if you want it, I've got extras. I'm not wearing them. You might as well get them. So you can always go check that out. And I have shirts like this. If you want a really comfy 3/4 shirt with a cool logo on it, you can always get those.
Have you ever had any interactions with maybe former players just from that era who have just discovered you or discovered your website and like, hey, wow, I remember that, or bring up some memories, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up from time to time. It's when you get, things build up. When I first started this, I had 30 or 40 followers, and I was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I could get 1,000 followers? Well, now I got almost 30,000. So sometimes it's hard to track who your followers are. Back in the day, for the first year or so, I tried to follow everybody back who followed me. Can't do that anymore because eBay or Twitter won't let you follow everybody, and it just gets to the point where it's too much glut on there. But I mean, I have a few. Dennis Eckersley, Rod Carew, Fred Lynn, some of these guys who I tweet about a lot follow me, which I think is about the cool. If you want to say one really cool thing about the new age of baseball is there's no way that I could have just been friends with Dennis Eckersley in 1978 because I liked his uniform. But now, that's what happens. And it's cool to have a community like that.
No, that's an excellent point. The technology, yeah. I mean, you could tag somebody or at them, whatever, Instagram, and get in touch with. Yeah, actually, it is a good point that, yeah, players today make more money, but at a certain point, you can interact with a player, which you couldn't do decades ago. So I guess it's a good point on just the give and take of that.
Several years ago, I went up to Hockey Day in Canada. It was in Kamloops, British Columbia, which is about a 10-hour drive from where I'm at here in Portland. And they bring out a whole bunch of old players and stuff like that. And we went to this thing. It's about 6 years ago, I'm going to say. And you just walk in the lobby of the hotel, and there's Lanny McDonald on the elevator with you and stuff. You don't really get that as much in baseball, football, basketball. It's just there's more, again, like you were saying, they're making more money. They're in a different section than the rest of us are, right? But Twitter and I guess Instagram, I'm sort of learning about Instagram. I haven't really done much of that yet, but I'm starting an account. But Twitter gives you the opportunity to sort of meet these people without them having to, put themselves in, I guess, I don't want to say danger, but put themselves out there into the community. They don't have to go around and do all this different stuff. They can just be on Twitter, and I can be on Twitter, and they can say, hey, I like what you're doing. And I can say, hey, I love what you're doing. So it's kind of a cool situation.
Yeah, it's neat. And it's neat from those players, especially from that era that you like, that are, following you. This is, that's great. So I was going over your site, and I like the way you break down each team and kind of the history during the 70s of their uniform, and some interesting facts like I never knew about, like the 1976 White Sox actually wearing shorts and high socks. I mean, is there any other just like cool little things like that that you discovered just by doing this research?
Oh, there's all kinds of great, again, and that's part of what's great about the 70s is that there's so many different cool things going on. Back then, that White Sox story, I get a lot of people who have a recollection of it will sort of bring up things to me when I post about the shorts. People think it was just their regular uniform that they wore for a whole year or whatever. They had that style uniforms with the faux collared shirt and all that stuff, and the different colored pants and jerseys. They had that for 6 years, I think 76 to 81. But they only wore those shorts 3 times in August of 1976. It was sort of a gimmick, but they wore, I think one was in the double header, and they didn't want to have to wash the uniforms in between games, things like that. But I love it because people have these recollections of that stuff, and oh yeah, it was so great when they were doing this, and I, remind them, hey, that's a great recollection, but they really only did that 3 times. The White Sox had the same thing with that. I think it was that same year, the year after that, their hat was white on the top. They only wore that for a couple weeks on the road, I think, and other teams complained because the white hat looked too much like the ball. The Phillies had a similar situation when they came out with their new logo, that the P logo with the sort of swirl in the middle. They had that sort of stitching in the logo, but when they first came out with that logo, they had button-up jerseys, and they had that. But then when they went to the zipper jerseys, they had to eliminate that because you're not allowed to have a ball on your jersey, and they felt that looked like a ball, so they eliminated that for 10 years and then brought it back later when they said, hey, it's not that much of a ball. But there's a lot of those kind of things. One thing that I've always something that I call unicorn, which is any jersey, hat, uniform that was only worn for one season. So there's a lot of those. My favorite of those is the 1978 Padres. The Padres hosted the All-Star game that year. So they had a special patch on their jersey, and they wore special jerseys, and they had all different, they had white, yellow, and brown jerseys, and they had white and yellow pants, and they wore all kinds of combinations. But it said San Diego and Padres on the jersey. It was the only year that they had that, and it was 2 different fonts, which everybody always gets going. The White Sox are big on this, where the font doesn't match the jersey font doesn't match the hat font or whatever it is. To me, that's awesome. I love that. That's one of the great things about the 70s is things didn't necessarily match. You didn't have everything computerized. There was just some dude cutting out, stitching of what this logo is. Again, back to the Padres, 1972 was the first year that they introduced what they call the bell hat, where it had the bell shape on the front of it. The hat was brown and the front was yellow. Well, I call that year, they only wore it, I think, Sunday home games that year. I call that the snowflake hat, because the way they did it at first, the bell thing went all the way over onto the sides, and they were just basically cutting out fabric. And I call it the snowflake hat because there's no two alike. It's impossible to make those things the same. New Era can't remake that hat because it's impossible to make those things the same. Now, the next year they came out with it was just a triangle, and they used that for 12 years or whatever. But there's a lot of that, along the Yankees line. The Yankees are one team that didn't change, right? You got your pinstripes. Now, every once in a while, they change how wide the pinstripes were or something like that. But for me, I like the 70s Yankees road jerseys because they had the trim on the sleeves. I thought that, for me, trim is cool. And they had the outline on the New York, right? But 1973, to me, is my favorite Yankees jersey ever. They put and I think I have a hat with this on it. If you look at this right here, the 1973 50th anniversary Yankee Stadium patch. They put it on the sleeve. It was one of the only years that they actually had a real sleeve patch, not an armband because somebody had passed away, but an actual sleeve patch. It's an awesome patch. And so things like that, it's pretty cool. And, you go to my website, I've got every team from every season in the 1970s of what uniforms they wore. I think eventually I might expand that into the early 80s because some of the early 80s stuff is pretty cool. But right now, if you want to know, what uniforms did the Cleveland Indians wear during 1976 and what kind of patches did they have on their jerseys, you can go to polyesterunis.com. You can check it out. My recollection doesn't go from the early 70s isn't that great, but I always would watch old stuff. My dad was big into that stuff and whatnot. And I didn't know that until a few years ago. And I'm like, hey, there's something different about this Yankees jersey. And I started looking closely and doing some research. Hey, yeah, they had an awesome patch on the sleeve there. And that's great. I love it.
Yeah, I think maybe because maybe not many Yankee fans know about that because obviously the 73 team and plus just in general, the early 70s for the Yankees was brutal. So I just think a lot of people just didn't want to remember those years at all. But,
and the other thing is that the year after that is when they moved out of Yankee Stadium for 2 years because they had to rebuild it. They were playing at Shea Stadium. And I get a lot of comments on that. I'll post a picture of an American League player playing at Shea Stadium, and people will be like, "What the heck is going on here? Why is he at Shea?" Well, 74 and 75, the Yankees played at Shea Stadium because that was a serious rebuild of that stadium.
You mentioned before that, and I was going to ask you about this. I always assumed that all jerseys were button up, but there actually was sometimes what it was a zip up, which a pitcher could maybe scuff the ball up a little bit. I'm surprised they allowed that.
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest, that the zip up jerseys, there was a few of them in the 70s. The White Sox wore them from 71 to 75. Everybody always thinks that the White Sox colors are black. I get a lot of comments when I post something with the White Sox. Oh, the White Sox should always be black and white. Well, no, until 1991, they were rarely black and white. They changed their colors all the time. Mostly they were navy, but they were blue sometimes. They were red sometimes. But yeah, they had the zipper jerseys. The Phillies kind of followed them into that with the zipper jerseys. But zipper jerseys were actually big in the flannel days, in the wool flannel days. I think it just made it easier for them to keep them closed and whatnot, because if you have any wool flannel jerseys, the way the buttons work and the sewing is harder to do on a wool flannel jersey than it is on a polyester jersey, or at least harder to keep set and then launder so that it doesn't shrink up and the buttons won't fit, right? So I do this thing called polyester rankings, where I take a whole weekend and I just take a subject and do a countdown of them. For instance, I did 1970s mustaches a few weeks ago. I've done for 1978 uniforms or 1981 uniforms or 70s hats or 80s hats, whatever. Well, I did one for zipper jerseys, and going through all that research, back in the 50s, there were a ton of different zipper jerseys and some really cool ones. So, that's pretty cool. And then, of course, in that 70s and 80s, you had what I call the polyester pullover era. You had pullover jerseys, and to me that makes sense. I mean, of course, when I was a kid, that's what we wore in Little League, is you wore pullover jerseys. But to me, that makes sense. It's like wearing a t-shirt. It's more comfortable, right? So, and you can do more cool stuff with it.
All right, and you mentioned a number of different pieces that you like, but is there one that sticks out? I know it's hard. You have so many teams and so many years of the 70s, but what would we say is your favorite of all the uniforms?
My favorite uniform, I generally will say if you want to just take one certain a year, the 1978 Padres that I was just talking about, but also the 77 to 79 Pirates. You gotta like that because you had so many I think I figured out you got 36 different combinations, right? Because you had the pillbox hats, right, with the stripes going around them, the old school. Actually, where the pillbox hats came from at the time. In 1976, the National League celebrated its 100th anniversary. So it was and a lot of people think, oh, they did all this stuff for the bicentennial. No, the National League was founded in 1876. So in 1976, the National League had its 100th anniversary, and a bunch of teams wore the pillbox hats because that's what they were wearing at the turn of the century. And so if you go back and you look at pictures from that year, the Pirates and the Cardinals were kind of the two teams that really took it and said, hey, we're going to wear this for the Pirates. It was all their games. For the Cardinals, most of them, but most National League teams had a pillbox hat that they would wear at some point. They even had them for that All-Star game. They had special with just an N on it, National League All-Star hats with a pillbox. But anyway, the Pirates kept those around. They were the only team to actually keep them past 1976. So in 77 to 79, they had a yellow one and they had a black one. So they had a yellow one with black pinstripe or stripes going around it, a black one with yellow stripes. Then they had a yellow jersey, they had a black jersey. They had that triple pinstripe jersey I talked about. And they had pants to match each of those jerseys. And they had yellow stirrups or black stirrups. So they could do all these different combinations. So again, if you go to my website and you check out the Pirates from 77 to 79, there's a bunch of pictures because you got so many. Sometimes they wore a black jersey with yellow pants. Sometimes they wore a yellow jersey with striped pants. Just all different things. And to me, that's just good stuff. I mean, even better than just being colorful and unique and changing it up. And the Padres did the same thing in '78. The Astros with their Tequila Sunrise uniforms. My favorite Tequila Sunrise was the 1975. That would be a unicorn. It was the first year they came out with it. There's hard to find pictures of these because they only used it for 1 year. Although that year, Bob Watson scored the 1 millionth run in history. So there's a good picture of him running across home plate at Candlestick Park, and you can see the back of his jersey. But on the back of their jerseys, they had this big round number plate. So it was a big round white plate with a stylized Navy number on it. Well, they only used it for 1 year because that plate was heavy. It was a tackle twill, and it took up like the entire back. And it got hot in the summertime. So their backs would get really hot, and the players complained, and they got rid of it after that season. But that's a great jersey. So I like those sort of interesting things. Again, I like it when it's not perfect. I like the kind of different stuff. I like when the White Sox had a socks on their hat and a socks on their jersey, but it wasn't exactly the same. I like stuff like that.
Now, and this, you mentioned the Tequila Sunrise. A lot of people say that was the ugliest uniform. You seem to like it. In your mind, then what would be like the ugliest of the '70s?
Oh, well, I don't, and that's something that I do on my Twitter page. I have something called you spelled awesome wrong. So if somebody responds to one of my tweets with that's ugly or that's hideous or that's terrible or whatever, I'll just quote tweet them with you spelled awesome wrong. Because to me, it's all awesome. I'm not about negative stuff. I'm about positive stuff. At the time, I might have thought some of that stuff was ugly, but now looking back, there's a lot of that stuff you think back on it, and it's like, hey, you know what? I thought that was ugly at the time, but thinking back, it's not boring. To me, and again, Yankees, Dodgers, those teams especially, they are. I mean, there's nothing more iconic than a Yankees uniform or a Dodgers uniform, and I love those uniforms. But if you're thinking '70s and interesting, those would be the most boring, I guess. And there's nothing wrong with that, to be honest. I love those uniforms. But when you're looking back at all the crazy stuff that these teams did, and the Yankees and the Dodgers were just blah, 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 blah. So I guess I wouldn't say ugly, but I would say those are the two most boring.
It's boring. And your website comments, you've seen one Yankee uniform, you've seen them all. So Spencer, I appreciate spending his time with us and giving us this great insight. Again, people could follow you on Twitter, Polyester Unis. Also check out the website, polyesterunis.com, and you see all these great stories. And let's hope, for modern baseball, we get some more mustaches.
Oh, absolutely. Mustaches galore, baby.